December 7, 1941, the date that forever changed America's destiny, arrived with fire and smoke over Pearl Harbor, and in that chaos, military planners realized a brutal truth. The United States was woefully unprepared for the aerial warfare that would dominate the coming conflict. While historians would later obsess over the Mustang's elegance and the Thunderbolt's raw power, they would consistently overlook a remarkable aircraft that fought in every theater of the war, survived impossible odds, and earned the grudging respect of both allies and enemies alike. The Republic P-47. Thunderbolt has received its accolades. The North American P-51 Mustang became legendary, but the Douglas A-26 Invader remained stubbornly absent from popular memory, despite being arguably the most versatile and effective combat aircraft America produced during World War II. The story begins not with Pearl Harbor, but 3 years earlier in the design offices of Douglas Aircraft Company in Santa Monica, California. Edward Heinemann, a brilliant engineer who would later design the legendary A-4 Skyhawk, sat hunched over drafting tables in 1938, sketching the contours of what he believed would revolutionize attack aviation. The military had requested a replacement for the aging Douglas A-20 Havoc, and Heinemann envisioned something unprecedented. A twin-engine attack bomber that could fly as fast as fighters, carry devastating ordnance, and protect itself with overwhelming firepower. His colleagues thought him mad. The specifications seemed contradictory, impossible to reconcile in a single airframe. According to records preserved in the National Museum of the United States Air Force Archives, Heinemann's initial design called for a sleek, all-metal monoplane with tricycle landing gear, still revolutionary in that era, and a radical weapons layout that would allow the aircraft to function as both a level bomber and a devastating ground attack platform. The design incorporated lessons learned from the Spanish Civil War, where German and Italian aircraft had demonstrated the deadly effectiveness of well-armed, fast attack planes. Heinemann studied combat reports with obsessive attention, noting how Republican forces had struggled against nationalist bombers that could outrun their fighter escorts. The Douglas Company submitted the design to the United States Army Air Corps in July 1940, just as the Battle of Britain raged across the English Channel. Military planners, watching German Heinkel and Dornier bombers pound British cities, while Spitfires and Hurricanes struggled to intercept them, recognized the potential immediately. They awarded Douglas a contract for 3 prototypes on September 9, 1940, with specifications that would have intimidated lesser engineers. Maximum speed exceeding 350 miles per hour, operational ceiling above 22,000 feet, and enough internal bomb capacity to deliver a knockout punch to hardened targets. The first prototype, designated XA-26, rolled out of Douglas's Long Beach facility on July 10, 1942, nearly 2 years after the contract signing. Test pilot Ben Howard climbed into the cockpit on that sweltering summer morning, surrounded by engineers who had poured their expertise into every rivet and control surface. When Howard advanced the throttles and the twin Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engines roared to life, generating 4,000 horsepower combined, observers felt the ground vibrate beneath their feet. The aircraft accelerated down the runway with shocking speed, lifting off after a remarkably short roll. What happened next would validate Heinemann's vision and begin the Invader's journey toward becoming the most underrated combat aircraft of the war. Ben Howard pushed the XA-26 through a series of increasingly aggressive maneuvers during that maiden flight on July 10, 1942, and radioed back observations that thrilled the Douglas engineering team. The aircraft handled like a fighter, despite weighing over 35,000 pounds fully loaded, responding crisply to control inputs, and demonstrating none of the sluggishness typical of twin-engine attack planes. When Howard landed after a 90-minute flight, he emerged from the cockpit grinning broadly, declaring the Invader the finest aircraft he had ever flown. His enthusiasm proved infectious, though significant challenges remained before the design would be combat-ready. The Army Air Forces, redesignated from Army Air Corps on June 20, 1941, observed the test program with intense interest. By late 1942, American forces were engaging Japanese forces across the Pacific and German forces in North Africa, accumulating combat experience that revealed glaring deficiencies in existing attack aircraft. The Douglas A-20 Havoc and North American B-25 Mitchell, while capable, lacked the speed to evade interceptors, and the firepower to suppress heavily defended targets. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces, pushed Douglas to accelerate development, recognizing that the invader could provide tactical commanders with a weapon system matching the flexibility of operational requirements. Douglas engineers worked around the clock throughout 1943, refining the design based on combat feedback filtering back from operational theaters. They strengthened the wing structure to handle increased ordnance loads, redesigned the bomb bay to accept everything from 100-pound general-purpose bombs to the massive 2,000-pound armor-piercing weapons used against hardened bunkers. The nose section underwent particular scrutiny, with 3 configurations emerging: a bombardier nose with a Norden bomb sight for precision-level bombing, a solid nose mounting 650 caliber machine guns for devastating ground attack, and a hybrid configuration balancing both capabilities. The firepower specifications alone distinguished the invader from contemporary aircraft. According to documentation from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey archives, the standard gun nose variant mounted 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns in the nose, 2 more in a dorsal turret, 2 in a ventral turret, and provisions for wing-mounted gun pods that could add 8 additional guns. This 18-gun configuration delivered a weight of fire exceeding 11,000 rounds per minute, more than most heavy bombers and sufficient to shred soft targets or suppress anti-aircraft positions. Pilots who would later fly combat missions described the sensation of triggering this arsenal as riding an earthquake, the entire airframe shuddering as thousands of 50 caliber rounds streaked toward targets. Production authorization came on September 4, 1943, with initial orders for 500 aircraft. Douglas immediately encountered problems scaling up manufacturing, competing with other aircraft programs for materials, machine tools, and skilled workers. The company's Santa Monica and Long Beach facilities operated triple shifts, workers sleeping in nearby dormitories between 12-hour shifts, assembling invaders alongside A-20 Havocs and C-47 transports. Women comprised over 40% of the workforce, operating drill presses, bucking rivets, and performing intricate electrical work that previous generations had considered exclusively male domains. The first production A-26 Invader, serial number 4322294, rolled off the Long Beach assembly line on February 15, 1944. Douglas workers gathered around the gleaming aircraft, olive drab paint still tacky, feeling justifiable pride in their achievement. The Invader represented over 1 million engineering hours, countless design iterations, and the collective expertise of America's aviation industry. Yet challenges remained before the aircraft would prove itself in combat, challenges that would test not just the machine's capabilities, but the courage of the men who would fly it into desperate battles across 2 hemispheres. The 553rd Bombardment Squadron, stationed at Gosfield Airfield in Essex, England, received the first operational A-26 Invaders during September 1944, and the air crews approached the gleaming new aircraft with mixture of excitement and skepticism. These were seasoned combat veterans who had flown hundreds of missions in A-20 Havocs and Martin B-26 Marauders, men who trusted their lives to familiar aircraft and viewed innovations with suspicion born of hard experience. Major Robert Moore, squadron commander, conducted the first familiarization flight on September 19, 1944, and landed 2 hours later with reservations that would prove prophetic. Moore reported that while the Invader possessed extraordinary speed and firepower, the cockpit layout confused pilots accustomed to other Douglas aircraft, and the visibility from the bombardier position was inadequate for low-altitude attack missions. More troubling, the aircraft's high landing speed, over 120 miles per hour, exceeded that of the Havoc by nearly 30%, requiring longer runways and greater pilot skill during the critical moments of approach and touchdown. Several training accidents during October reinforced these concerns, with one Invader overshooting Gosfield's runway and colliding with parked vehicles, killing the co-pilot and injuring ground personnel. The 9th Air Force, commanded by Lieutenant General Hoyt Vandenberg, nevertheless pushed forward with operational deployment. Intelligence reports indicated German forces were constructing reinforced defensive positions throughout France and Belgium, preparation for the expected Allied advance into Germany proper. Traditional medium bombers struggled against these hardened targets, while fighter bombers, lacked the payload capacity for sustained attacks. The invader, with its combination of speed, bomb load, and defensive armament, seemed ideally suited for the mission profile. Vandenberg ordered the 553rd Squadron to commence combat operations on November 6, 1944. That first mission targeted German communications facilities near Saint-Vith, Belgium, a transportation hub supporting Wehrmacht forces resisting Allied advances. 9 invaders launched from Gosfield before dawn, flying northeast through deteriorating weather that grounded most tactical aircraft that morning. Major Moore led the formation, Bombardier Nose variant, allowing his navigator to employ the Norden bomb sight for precision attack. They crossed the English Channel at 8,000 feet, cloud layers obscuring the gray waters below, each pilot monitoring engine instruments and scanning skies for Luftwaffe fighters that still occasionally challenged Allied air superiority. The target appeared through broken clouds at 0900 hours, and Moore aligned his invader for the bomb run, while his navigator peered through the Norden sight, making minute corrections transmitted electrically to the autopilot. German anti-aircraft batteries surrounding Saint-Vith opened fire immediately, filling the sky with explosive 88mm shells that burst in angry black clouds around the American formation. Moore held the aircraft steady despite concussions rocking the airframe, trusting his navigator to deliver the bombs accurately. At precisely 0903, the bomb bay doors snapped open, and 4,500-pound general-purpose bombs tumbled toward the target, their fins stabilizing them for the 5-second fall. The results exceeded expectations. Post-strike reconnaissance photographs revealed the communications center destroyed, surrounding buildings collapsed, and rail lines severed in multiple locations. All 9 invaders returned to Gosfield despite intense anti-aircraft fire, though several sustained damage requiring extensive repairs. Moore filed an after-action report praising the invaders' speed. They had outrun several German fighters that attempted interception and bomb-carrying capacity, while reiterating concerns about landing characteristics and cockpit visibility. His assessment reached 9th Air Force headquarters within hours, sparking debates about whether the invaders' advantages outweighed its operational challenges. Those debates became moot 3 weeks later, when German forces launched their desperate Ardennes offensive, forever known as the Battle of the Bulge. December 16, 1944, dawned cold and misty across the Belgian Ardennes, the weather so foul that Allied tactical aircraft remained grounded while 3 German armies smashed through thinly held American lines in a desperate gamble to split Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's offensive caught Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower completely by surprise, with over 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks surging westward through narrow forest roads, overwhelming inexperienced American divisions and threatening to recreate the catastrophic breakthrough of May 1940. The weather, which German planners had counted on to neutralize Allied air superiority, persisted for days, turning the battlefield into a nightmarish confusion of isolated firefights and desperate retreats. The skies finally cleared on December 23, 1944, and Lieutenant General Vandenberg launched every available aircraft against German forces now dangerously close to the Meuse River. The 553rd Squadron scrambled 18 A-26 invaders from Gosfield, their mission to interdict German supply columns moving through the town of Saint-Vith, ironically, the same target they had struck 6 weeks earlier. Major Moore led one 9-aircraft flight while Captain James Wilson commanded the second, both formations loaded with fragmentation bombs and incendiary clusters designed to devastate soft-skinned vehicles and exposed infantry. They crossed into Belgium at 12,000 feet, visibility unlimited after days of clouds and fog, and immediately observed the scale of the German offensive. Smoke columns rose from dozens of locations, marking burning towns and destroyed vehicles, while roads below teemed with military traffic moving in both directions. German anti-aircraft batteries, having anticipated renewed air attacks, opened fire while the invaders were still miles from Saint-Vith, forcing Moore to begin evasive maneuvers earlier than planned. He led his flight into a shallow dive, accelerating toward 360 miles per hour as they descended through increasingly intense flak. Moore's bombardier released their ordnance at 5,000 feet, directly over a German convoy comprising trucks, half-tracks, and horse-drawn wagons. The Wehrmacht, despite its reputation for mechanization, still relied heavily on horses for logistics, The fragmentation bombs exploded across the road in overlapping patterns, shredding vehicles and scattering personnel. Behind more, 8 more invaders released similar loads, transforming 2 miles of highway into an inferno. Captain Wilson's flight struck a parallel road 3 miles north with identical results, their incendiary clusters igniting fuel trucks and ammunition carriers that exploded in spectacular fireballs visible for miles. The German response was immediate and ferocious. Luftwaffe fighters, grounded during the offensive's opening days, now scrambled from bases in western Germany to challenge Allied air attacks. 6 Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters intercepted Wilson's flight as they aggressed the target area, closing at tremendous speed and firing 20mm cannon from extreme range. The invaders' dorsal and ventral turrets returned fire, tracers streaking between aircraft, while pilots advanced throttles to maximum power and dove toward terrain-masking hills. The ensuing combat lasted perhaps 90 seconds, but demonstrated the invaders' survivability against determined fighter attack. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano, dorsal gunner in Wilson's aircraft, engaged the attacking FW-190s with sustained bursts from his twin 50-caliber guns, his tracers converging on the lead German fighter at 400 yards range. The Focke-Wulf staggered, smoke streaming from its cowling, then rolled inverted and plunged toward the snow-covered landscape below. A second FW-190 pressed its attack despite Romano's defensive fire, cannon shells striking Wilson's invader along the fuselage and severing hydraulic lines. Wilson fought the crippled aircraft, maintaining control through sheer physical strength as the formation raced west toward Allied lines. All 18 invaders returned to Gosfield, though Wilson's aircraft required emergency landing procedures and extensive battle damage repair. The mission demonstrated what the invader could achieve under desperate circumstances, beginning a campaign that would continue throughout the brutal winter. While European operations garnered attention from senior commanders and war correspondents, the A-26 Invaders' Pacific combat debut occurred with far less fanfare, but equal significance. The 319 Bombardment Group, based at Angauer Airfield in the Palau Islands, received its first invaders during January 1945, replacing war-weary B-25 Mitchells that had supported General Douglas MacArthur's Philippines campaign since the late landings 3 months earlier. Lieutenant Colonel David Campbell, group commander, viewed the invaders skeptically, questioning whether their speed advantages would matter against Japanese forces increasingly reliant on dispersed camouflage positions that negated precision bombing. Campbell's concerns reflected broader debates about tactical air power doctrine in the Pacific theater. Unlike Europe, where clearly defined front lines and concentrated enemy formations provided lucrative targets, Pacific operations involved island-hopping campaigns where Japanese defenders occupied caves, bunkers, and jungle positions nearly invisible from the air. American fighter bombers and medium bombers frequently expended ordnance against empty terrain, while Japanese forces remained concealed, emerging to counterattack once aircraft departed. The invaders' speed, which proved invaluable in Europe where German anti-aircraft defenses and fighter opposition remained formidable, seemed less relevant against an enemy that rarely challenged Allied air superiority after mid-1944. The 319th Group conducted its first invader mission on January 28, 1945, targeting Japanese positions on the island of Corregidor, which guarded Manila Bay and had to be neutralized before Allied shipping could utilize the Philippines' most important port. Intelligence reports indicated approximately 5,000 Japanese troops occupied Corregidor's extensive tunnel systems and coastal defense installations, including numerous artillery pieces capable of engaging vessels throughout Manila Bay. MacArthur planned an airborne and amphibious assault for February 16, requiring intensive aerial preparation to suppress Japanese defenses without destroying terrain features that would provide cover for American paratroopers. 12 invaders launched from Angkor at dawn, flying north-northwest across 600 miles of tropical Pacific waters. Colonel Campbell led the formation, his aircraft configured with the solid gun nose mounting 650 caliber machine guns, rather than the Bombardier variant used in Europe. The mission profile called for low-altitude strafing attacks against identified Japanese positions, accepting increased exposure to ground fire in exchange for greater accuracy. Campbell intended to demonstrate whether the invaders' concentrated firepower could neutralize point targets that had frustrated previous attacks. They arrived over Corregidor at 0830 hours. the fortress island appearing as a tadpole-shaped rock jutting from Manila Bay's azure waters. Campbell led his flight down to 500 feet altitude, lining up on Japanese artillery positions visible on Corregidor's eastern cliffs. He triggered all 6 nose guns simultaneously, and the invader shuddered as thousands of armor-piercing 50-caliber rounds streaked toward the target. Explosions rippled across the cliff face as ammunition stores detonated, followed by secondary blasts indicating fuel or explosives had ignited. Behind Campbell, 11 more invaders executed similar attacks, their combined firepower devastating Japanese positions that had withstood weeks of conventional bombing. Japanese anti-aircraft fire proved surprisingly intense, despite preliminary attacks supposedly having suppressed defensive weapons. 25mm automatic cannons engaged the invaders from concealed positions, their fire accurate and sustained. Lieutenant Richard Hayes's aircraft took multiple hits during its strafing run, losing hydraulic pressure and sustaining damage to the port engine. Hayes struggled to maintain altitude as his invader slowed, falling behind the formation while engine oil pressure dropped toward zero. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant James Park, transmitted distress calls while scanning the ocean below for potential ditching sites, knowing their chances of surviving a water landing were marginal at best. Campbell immediately ordered the formation to orbit Hayes's crippled aircraft, maintaining defensive positions, while the damaged invader limped toward Allied-controlled Mindoro Island, 70 miles northeast of Corregidor. The next 40 minutes tested nerves and airmanship as Hayes coaxed maximum performance from his failing engines, gradually losing altitude despite his best efforts. Lieutenant Hayes pushed his crippled invader through the tropical sky, every instrument gauge telling him the aircraft was dying beneath his hands, yet he refused to abandon the machine that had carried his crew through dozens of combat missions. The port engine's cylinder head temperature climbed past critical limits, metal components expanding and warping as lubricating oil sprayed from ruptured seals and disappeared into the slipstream. His flight engineer, Technical Sergeant Robert Chen, monitored engine instruments from his position behind the cockpit, calling out readings with professional calm that belied their desperate situation. The starboard engine continued running normally, but one engine could not sustain flight indefinitely with battle damage disrupting the aircraft's aerodynamics. Colonel Campbell maintained formation on Hayes's port wing, his crew scanning constantly for Japanese fighters that might capitalize on a straggling bomber. The Pacific War had taught brutal lessons about wounded aircraft. Japanese pilots targeted cripples mercilessly, knowing single kills required less ammunition and risk than engaging formed defensive positions. Campbell radioed Mindoro's air traffic control, requesting emergency landing clearance and alerting crash crews to prepare for a potential wheels-up landing if Hayes's hydraulic systems failed completely. The controller acknowledged, reporting Mindoro's single runway clear and emergency equipment standing by. Mindoro appeared on the horizon at 0945, the island's volcanic peaks jutting from the sea like broken teeth. Hayes began a slow descent, nursing his dying aircraft through each 1,000 feet of altitude loss, fighting control pressures that increased as hydraulic pressure bled away. His bombardier, Second Lieutenant Thomas Rodriguez, cranked the landing gear down manually using the emergency extension system, a physically exhausting process requiring dozens of revolutions of a hand crank located in the nose compartment. The main gear locked down successfully, but the nose gear indicator remained dark, suggesting the nose strut had not fully extended or the indicating system had failed. Campbell flew ahead to Mindoro, made a low pass over Hayes's aircraft, and confirmed the nose gear appeared partially extended but cocked at an angle that virtually guaranteed collapse during landing. He radioed this information to Hayes, who acknowledged without emotion, his training and experience allowing him to focus on the immediate tasks required for survival. Hayes configured the invader for landing, extending flaps manually and reducing speed to barely above stalling velocity. The starboard engine continued running smoothly, but without hydraulic boost, the controls required both pilots' strength to manipulate. Hayes crossed Mindoro's coastline at 300 feet altitude. Mindoro Tower cleared him to land on any portion of the runway he could reach, standard procedure for emergency landings. Fire trucks and ambulances raced along the runway's edge, crews preparing for the worst. Hayes descended through 200 feet, 100 feet, 50 feet, his co-pilot calling out altitude while Hayes focused entirely on maintaining the precise control inputs necessary to arrest descent without stalling. The Invader's main gear touched Mindoro's coral-surfaced runway at precisely 125 miles per hour, and for 2 seconds, Hayes thought they might survive intact. Then the damaged nose gear collapsed, and the Invader's nose plowed into the runway surface in a shower of sparks and grinding metal. The aircraft skidded forward, slowing rapidly as friction converted kinetic energy into heat and noise. Hayes and Park braced against their harnesses as deceleration forces pinned them against their seats, the cockpit filling with coral dust and smoke. Behind them, Chen and the gunners assumed crash positions, protecting heads and necks against the violent deceleration. The Invader finally stopped 700 feet from initial touchdown, its nose demolished but fuselage intact, and Hayes shut down the surviving engine while his crew evacuated through the dorsal hatch. All 6 crew members emerged without serious injury and stood watching as fire crews sprayed foam over the wreckage, ensuring no fuel fires erupted from ruptured tanks. Colonel Campbell landed minutes later and drove directly to the crash site, embracing Hayes with uncharacteristic emotion. Campbell later wrote in his mission report that Hayes's performance demonstrated not just exceptional piloting skill, but the Invader's structural integrity, noting that comparable battle damage would likely have resulted in catastrophic failure in older aircraft types. The incident reinforced Campbell's growing appreciation for the Invader's capabilities, transforming his skepticism into advocacy. The 319th Group continued intensive operations supporting MacArthur's Philippines campaign throughout February and March 1945, their invaders proving remarkably effective against Japanese defensive positions. Spring 1945 brought Allied forces to Germany's doorstep in Europe and Japan's home islands in the Pacific, and A-26 Invader units participated in the war's final, desperate campaigns with accumulated experience that maximized the aircraft's capabilities. The 416th Bombardment Group, operating from Malin Airfield south of Paris, conducted round-the-clock missions against German transportation networks, attempting to prevent Wehrmacht forces from establishing coherent defensive lines along the Rhine River. Major Thomas "Tommy" Maguire, who would later earn fame as one of America's leading aces, flew several missions in Invaders during March 1945, praising the aircraft's combination of speed and payload capacity. According to records preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency archives at Maxwell Air Force Base, Invader units flew over 11,000 combat sorties during the war's final 3 months, dropping more than 37 million pounds of ordnance and firing nearly 100 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition against Axis targets. These statistics pale compared to heavy bomber totals, but represent remarkable intensity for a relatively small number of aircraft and aircrews. The Invader's sortie rate, average missions per aircraft per month, exceeded that of any other American tactical aircraft, demonstrating both mechanical reliability and crew confidence in the platform. The war in Europe ended officially on May 8, 1945, following Germany's unconditional surrender, but Pacific operations intensified as American forces prepared for the anticipated invasion of Japan's home islands. Invader units transferred from Europe to the Pacific, their crews and aircraft boarding transport ships for the month-long voyage to bases in the Philippines and Okinawa. The 319th Group, now veteran operators with 6 months of Pacific combat experience, prepared to support Operation Downfall, the planned November invasion of Kyushu Island. Intelligence estimates predicted Japanese defenders would employ kamikaze aircraft, suicide boats, and fanatical infantry resistance that would inflict hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Campbell, promoted after his performance during the Philippines campaign, briefed his pilots on projected Invader missions supporting the invasion. They would conduct pre-invasion strikes against Japanese airfields, destroying aircraft before they could launch, kamikaze attacks against invasion fleets. During the actual landings, invaders would provide close air support for ground forces, suppressing defensive positions and destroying counter-attacking formations. The missions would be brutal, high-intensity operations with expected losses approaching 10% per mission, casualties that would decimate experienced crews within weeks. Those missions never occurred. On August 6, 1945, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, instantly killing over 80,000 people and demonstrating weapon technology that rendered conventional military calculations obsolete. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki, while Soviet forces invaded Japanese-controlled Manchuria in overwhelming strength. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, though formal surrender ceremonies aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay would not occur until September 2nd. The A-26 invader community celebrated victory with relief rather than jubilation, knowing how many crews would have died in missions now canceled. Captain James Wilson, recovered from wounds sustained during the Battle of the Bulge, wrote to his wife describing the contradiction of feeling grateful for weapons that killed hundreds of thousands while saving millions. His letter, preserved in the National World War II Museum archives, captures the moral complexity confronting combat veterans who simultaneously honored their service while questioning warfare's fundamental nature. As American forces began occupation duties in Germany and Japan, military planners addressed the question of post-war force structure and equipment. The rapid demobilization that followed victory would mothball thousands of aircraft and discharge millions of personnel, but certain capabilities would remain essential for America's new role as global superpower and counter to Soviet expansion. The Invader, which had proven its versatility and effectiveness across multiple theaters and mission profiles, earned consideration for retention in a drastically reduced peacetime force, a testament to design excellence that would be validated in conflicts to come. The Douglas A-26 Invader service did not end with World War II's conclusion, though this fact remains largely unknown, even among aviation enthusiasts who can recite detailed specifications of Mustangs and Thunderbolts. The aircraft that military planners almost canceled due to landing accidents during 1944 would serve with distinction in Korea, Vietnam, and numerous covert operations spanning 4 decades, demonstrating adaptability that vindicated Edward Heinemann's original vision. Yet this remarkable longevity paradoxically contributed to the Invader's obscurity, as later modifications obscured its World War II heritage, and the aircraft became associated with Cold War conflicts rather than its original combat debut. The final production Invader rolled off Douglas's Long Beach assembly line on September 2, 1945, the same day Japan formally surrendered, and the Army Air Forces immediately canceled contracts for additional aircraft as part of massive demobilization. Douglas had manufactured 2,452 Invaders total, a modest production run compared to 18,000 B-24 Liberators or 15,000 B-17 Flying Fortresses, but sufficient to equip tactical bomber units worldwide. Most Invaders entered storage at sprawling desert facilities in Arizona and California, their aluminum skins sealed against corrosion, while military planners debated future requirements. The Korean War's outbreak in June 1950 recalled Invaders to combat, their combination of speed, payload, and defensive armament proving ideal for interdiction missions against North Korean and Chinese supply lines. Redesignated B-26, the original B-26 Marauder having been retired, Invaders flew thousands of night interdiction missions, their crews hunting truck convoys along the Yalu River and bombing bridges across North Korea's mountainous terrain. The aircraft's reliability impressed maintenance crews, with mission-capable rates exceeding 90%, despite harsh operating conditions and limited spare parts availability. Several Invader pilots became aces by destroying multiple enemy aircraft on the ground, demonstrating that air superiority could be achieved through destroying enemy aviation infrastructure rather than aerial combat. Vietnam would prove the Invaders' final conflict, though by then, the aircraft bore little resemblance to its World War II configuration. Extensively modified with updated avionics, improved engines, and strengthened airframes, these aircraft flew counterinsurgency missions throughout Southeast Asia from 1961 until 1969. Some participated in covert operations over Laos and Cambodia, their missions unacknowledged officially until decades later, when classified records underwent declassification. The Central Intelligence Agency operated several Invaders through front companies, using the aircraft's cargo capacity and stall capabilities for clandestine supply missions supporting anti-communist forces throughout the region. The final military invader retired from United States Air Force service on November 10, 1969, concluding a 25-year operational career spanning 3 wars and dozens of minor conflicts. Several examples survive in museums, their restored exteriors gleaming under display lighting. Yet visitor counts remain modest compared to exhibitions featuring more celebrated aircraft. The National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base displays an A-26 alongside Korean War exhibits, but most visitors hurry past toward the B-17 Memphis Belle or the Bockscar B-29 that dropped the Nagasaki atomic bomb. Historians debate why the invader remains obscure despite its remarkable record. Some argue that versatility works against historical recognition, as the aircraft never dominated a single mission profile sufficiently to establish clear identity in public consciousness. Others suggest timing played a role, with the invader entering service too late in World War II to accumulate the mission totals and dramatic incidents that generate popular legends. The aircraft never participated in celebrated raids like Doolittle's Tokyo attack or the Ploiești oil refinery missions, never dropped atomic weapons or pioneered strategic bombing doctrine. It simply worked effectively across multiple theaters and decades, performing unglamorous missions with professional competence. Edward Heinemann, the designer who conceived the invader during 1938, lived until 1991, long enough to witness his creation's complete service history and subsequent obscurity. In interviews conducted during the 1980s, Heinemann expressed philosophical acceptance of the invader's underrated status, noting that military effectiveness and popular recognition rarely correlate. He took satisfaction from knowing that crews who flew the aircraft trusted it completely, considering this professional validation more meaningful than public acclaim or historical prominence. The story of the Douglas A-26 invader remains incomplete without acknowledging the men who flew and maintained it through desperate combat and tedious occupation duties. Thousands of pilots, bombardiers, navigators, and gunners entrusted their lives to Heinemann's design, and thousands of mechanics, armorers, and support personnel kept those aircraft flying under conditions ranging from European mud to Pacific heat to Arctic cold. Their collective service represents the invader's true legacy, not dramatic incidents preserved in official histories, but accumulated missions flown competently and aircraft maintained professionally by people doing difficult jobs under challenging circumstances. December 7, 2024, marked 83 years since Pearl Harbor thrust America into World War II, and on that anniversary, perhaps a dozen restored invaders flew over memorial ceremonies and air shows, their distinctive engine notes reminding diminishing audiences of technologies and sacrifices from another era. The aircraft remain beautiful in flight, their sleek lines and purposeful configuration still suggesting speed and power. Yet beauty and capability do not guarantee remembrance, and the A-26 invader continues occupying its paradoxical position as simultaneously one of World War II's most effective combat aircraft and its most underrated. A contradiction that will likely persist as living memory of that conflict fades into documented history and finally into myth. The most underrated American combat plane of World War II earned that status honestly through decades of effective service that generated respect rather than fame, fulfilling Edward Heinemann's vision more completely than he likely imagined when sketching initial designs 86 years ago. Perhaps in the final accounting, that professional respect matters more than popular recognition, and the invader's legacy rests secure with those who knew its capabilities firsthand, rather than with subsequent generations distracted by more celebrated machines. The forgotten thunder continues echoing faintly through aviation history, awaiting rediscovery by historians willing to look beyond established narratives toward the unglamorous effectiveness that actually wins wars.